Hello, and thanks for joining us today for ACI Learning's audit webinar. Have a question? Use the GoToWebinar question box and we will answer as many as we can at the end. Now let's get started.
Hello and welcome to ACI Learning's webinar series. I'm Kelly Mack, an edutainer here at ACI Learning, and I'll be your host for today's webinar. If you're new to ACI Learning or you've been watching our content for a while now, we just want to say welcome and thank you for joining us. For those who are new to ACI Learning trains leaders in audit, cybersecurity, and IT. We deliver lifetime learning to over 250,000 engaged students, professionals, and organizations across 6 continents. To stay up to date with all things ACI Learning, check us out at acilearning.com and follow us on your favorite social media. Today we're talking about auditing your cybersecurity strategy, and I think you'll share in my excitement with the 2 gentlemen who we handpicked to help us navigate this. So let's introduce to you today's presenters. First and foremost, Jason Claycomb. He's the founder of Inarma LLC. Inarma is an organization that specializes in cybersecurity governance, risk management, and compliance. Prior to founding Inarma, Jason served as National Director of IT Services at Experis. He has more than 35 years of experience in cybersecurity, GRC, and IT audit, working with both local and international clients. Jason holds certifications in CISA and CISSP. Dr. Hernan Murdoch speaks at conferences in the United States and abroad. He's the author of numerous articles and books on a variety of topics, including internal audit, fraud, and more. He holds professional designations as a CIA and CRMA, and he currently serves as our Vice President of Audit right here at ACI Learning. Prior to that, he was a senior project manager leading audit and consulting projects for clients in the manufacturing, transportation, high-tech, education, insurance, and power generation industries. We'd love to get questions from you as we go along. So please ask your questions in the question panel in GoToWebinar on the right side of your screen. And we'll get to your questions after the presentation. This webinar is being recorded and a link to the recording will be sent to you within a week. You can also download today's slides and any additional handouts by clicking on the links in the handout panel. Now it's time to bring in Jason and Hernan for today's webinar. Thank you for joining us, guys. Where would you like to begin?
Thank you very much and welcome, Jason. So good to see you and so good to spend this time talking with you about such a very important topic. How are you today?
Doing well, thanks, Hernan. Great to connect up with you again on security and audit issues.
Wonderful. Yes. And, when we think about cybersecurity, we think about the risks, the threats, vulnerabilities, all of the downsides associated with it, and of course, so many different incidents that happen routinely in the world around us. But we don't want to think about it only from the perspective of the downside and create that image of victimhood, right? Where we were victims to all of these negative dynamics. We also want to think about the positive side of it and what we can do to help protect ourselves and our organizations. So when we think about that, I would imagine a strategy would probably be helpful. So Jason, where should we begin if we were to explore a strategy that will help us strengthen ourselves, harden organizations, and help organizations be better protected against this rising threat?
Well, great question, Hernan. And I think there's 2 things that we want to emphasize on cybersecurity strategy. Number 1 is that an organization needs to have some sort of a security strategy. You may be using your own, you may be using some methodology, which we'll talk more about in a little bit. But what we're really going to focus in on today is how to audit that strategy. But let's do a little bit of foundation setting here. So what is a cybersecurity strategy? It really is the way that your organization looks at security to protect your important data, of course, but also your people. And it addresses confidentiality, integrity, and availability, which are the 3 foundations that most auditors think about when they're thinking about data privacy or security. One thing in strategy that we have to mention too is it's not just about technology. Yeah, you can buy firewalls and you can get all the latest and greatest cloud tools from AWS or Microsoft Azure or whatever, but you also have to have processes to manage that technology. And of course, there are people that need to be involved because the technology is great, particularly in preventative controls. But there's somebody that needs to be able to review this stuff too. And of course, set it up and keep it up to date. So our strategy really needs to encompass all of these things. And what we'll be focusing in on this seminar is a lot more about how we go about auditing that strategy.
I like what you're saying, Jason, because one of the things that we sometimes assume is that technology will solve all of our problems. And while it may address a lot of our problems,
Yeah.
but it's not going to happen magically or automatically. We need to be very assertive in terms of what we need to do. So I like your approach in terms of making sure we have a strategy. And once again, not only having it, but also reviewing it periodically to make sure that it's doing what it's supposed to do. So what are some of the key things we need to keep in mind as we do this, which you're highlighting, a very important point around auditing this framework and this strategy?
Well, so let's talk a little bit about how you would audit your cybersecurity framework. First off, you need to understand your business. What kind of data do you have? Do you have any kind of PII, personally identifiable information, PI, personal information, PHI, protected health information, or whatever you want to call it? It's that personal information, both on our employees and our customers. And so thinking about customers, if we're in a business to business situation, we've got business emails of our counterparts. Okay, is that personal information that we need to protect? That's going to depend on the laws and regulations in your area, like under GDPR in the European Union, that is protected data. Now, it may not be in the United States. That's going to depend on your state laws. What I want to focus more on is, what about consumer or the general public data that we're collecting? That there are a lot of laws and regulations, and that's what most of us think about when we think about protecting personal information. So that's one side of it that's much more easy to point to, because there are a lot of different laws and regulations. And this seminar isn't going to go into all of those. There's just way too many of them for us to cover in this. But so we need to think about, what are those laws and regulations? What kind of private data do we have? But then what other kind of sensitive data do we have? I was talking with some friends last night about the formula for Coke. How sensitive is that formula? Well, there's all sorts of rumors about people disclosing that and trying to sell it and use it. But Coke does a pretty good job of protecting that formula. There's a lot of organizations like that as well, so that have very sensitive data that they want to protect, whether it's computer algorithms, the formulas for making metal or food products or what have you. And so we really need to understand that data and the data sensitivity. Once we know those, then we can start thinking about what kind of a framework we should have. But before, as auditors or cybersecurity professionals, we think about what we should have, what are we actually using? And we'll talk more about some of the common frameworks in a few minutes. Once we've identified the framework that we're using, are you using Jason's framework or using one of these standard industry methodologies? I really hope you're not using mine, okay, because I don't have one. And we should be using some sort of an industry framework. Then we can audit against that framework. But let's say your organization is using Jason's framework. Okay, audit against it. But also look at Jason's framework versus the NIST cybersecurity framework or the Center for Internet Security top 18 controls, and we'll get more into those in just a minute. And then we need to evaluate the maturity of our framework. And so those are the high level steps that we would go through. And so I realize I'm jumping ahead in a couple of things, but go ahead.
That's okay. No, one of the things that comes to mind, though, is that there's a very important role here when it comes to IT and cybersecurity governance, in the sense that the organization needs to really think about the markets where it operates, the industry it operates in, where its customers and vendors and employees are located or residing, and be aware of the different laws that may apply for different things. So we've got a little bit of a matrix of sorts, but governance becomes this big umbrella that we also need to make sure our organization is aware of and is embracing, so that we can do exactly what you just described, which is ask about what framework they are using, and then we can go to the next step, which is to review it. But they need to take that very important step as well and establish that that framework that they're going to be using. Otherwise, we are going to find ourselves at a loss with this.
Yeah, absolutely, Hernan. And one of the things that we're not going to cover in this is a lot about IT governance or cybersecurity governance,
Mhm.
except as it relates to one of these frameworks. Because we could spend another hour or multiple hours talking about enterprise governance as well. We could dive in deeper to IT governance. But what I want to do is talk a little bit more about what are some of the common frameworks, and then we'll talk more about how we actually get into auditing against one of these frameworks. So these are just a few of the more common frameworks. The NIST cybersecurity framework was put together under a presidential directive. It's really focused on protecting the critical infrastructure. That's what cybersecurity is. Okay, I realize that might be a definition that most of you know, but I often get a question, what is cybersecurity? It's anything connected to the internet. So the NIST cybersecurity framework is really about network connections, connections to your service providers, and so on. By the way, it's a very good framework, and you can add more stuff into it if you want, which I have done at some of my clients. A much more broad framework in some respects is the NIST 853. It's a special publication on security and privacy controls. Now, one of the big differences between these is the cybersecurity framework is optional. NIST 853, if you're a federal government agency or a contractor to federal agencies, you have to follow NIST 853. It's really focused in on information security and data privacy, and it's only US based. But by the way, if you're from somewhere else in the world, it's a really good framework. It's free. You can download it from NIST. Another one is the Center for Internet Security, or CIS. They used to call this the top 20. About a year ago, they did some major, very nice upgrades and came up with the top 18 critical security controls. The nice thing about all of these frameworks is they go across any industry. They can be used in any size of company. Okay, if you're going to follow NIST 853 to the highest maturity level, you got to be a really big organization. But smaller companies can even follow it. Now, I wanted to call out a couple of more regulation industry-based ones. That's PCI for the payment card industry. They have their data security standard. And then HITRUST is a similar organization to PCI, put together by a bunch of the health insurance companies and pharmaceutical companies, or I should say pharmacies, not pharmaceutical companies, related to HIPAA. Those you don't have to follow unless you're in one of those industries. But personally, I really like the PCI data security standards as a framework for controls. I used it in other companies that don't process credit cards because it's a good framework. So this goes back to the question of what framework are we using in our organization? So once we've determined what framework, we've got to start thinking about the maturity level in our organizations. So some of you may be familiar with the capability maturity model, which has been around for, I don't know, 30 or 40 years. That got bought by ISACA, who puts out COBIT, and they've done some modifications, and now it's called the Cybersecurity Maturity Model. And very high level here, because again, we could spend a lot of time going through this. It's a framework or a model for organizations to look at the security that they have in their organization. So where do we start? You've got to select a framework. One of those ones I just mentioned is fine. You've got to identify an assessment tool. That can be an Excel spreadsheet. I'm not saying you have to go buy software here. By the way, there are plenty of software vendors who will sell you software to help you assess your maturity levels. And then you have to conduct a security assessment. Some people may call this a gap assessment as well, because I want to find out where I am today in relation to that overall framework that I'm using in my organization. Once I know where I'm at today, then I can figure out what kinds of additional controls I need to put in place. Mind you, one challenge here on this slide here under the do section is implement security controls. But every organization already has controls in place. So when you're doing your planning and your doing section of this, you're looking at what you've got in place, policies, procedures, technology, training, and so on, to see where you are at the moment, to sort of circle back to plan to figure out what you need to do.
Is this an opportunity, Jason, where auditors can definitely partner with their IT counterparts, security counterparts, maybe even compliance, to verify what is in place, like you're talking about the training, the policies, and all of these things, but also checking to see what they're doing, because the training will be done by them, and the quality, the frequency, who is providing it. I would imagine these type of questions are integral to this as well.
Hernan, you hit it on the head there. You know, we can't do this in a vacuum. We've got to look at what framework is being used, who is responsible for it, what are all the people involved in implementing security. When we go back to that earlier slide about the people, processes, and the technology, about data integrity, system availability, that's what we're looking at in any one of these frameworks. And if you think about the CIS top 18, and I'm going to get more into it in a little bit too, but they're saying that there are 18 major categories of security controls that we should have in place in our organization, depending on what type of an organization we are. So that's where the check comes in. We want to check to see which of those controls we have in place out of NIST 853 or CIS top 18. And so there's a couple of things to do there. To your point, Hernan, maybe a compliance department, maybe internal audit has already done some of this type of auditing. Maybe the security department has done some self-assessments. Maybe they've already got a risk assessment. Maybe they're already doing various checks in some of these controls. Absolutely, I want to take a look at that, because that's helping me assess the maturity of the organization that I'm looking at. Mm-hmm. In any
can I also draw your attention to one thing that is really picking at my brain, and that is the third party component, because I took a peek at your chart, and if you put it back up, we'll take a look in under check, third party verification. Can you tell us a little bit more about that? Because I can imagine that being a very important component as well in this equation.
Good call out there, Hernan. I don't know what all the industries are and all the type of people are that'll be watching this right now or in the future. Some of the companies I work with have large mainframes in-house. Some of the clients that I work with today, the only thing they got in-house are laptops, and everything they've got is at a SaaS provider or a platform as a service provider. So we've got to verify how we're using those other third-party service providers. What kinds of data is going to those providers? How sensitive is it? And what kinds of controls are in place over those providers? And what kinds of controls are in place within those providers? So the first way I said it is more about governance. The second way I said it is more about what does AWS or Google or Salesforce actually have in place from a security perspective. So if your organization is outsourced to any of those companies or somebody else like SolarWinds, and I deliberately picked them because of the large breach they had a while back. How do we know whether that breach impacts us? So that's the checking side of it. And what I'm checking for is, how am I set up in alignment with the framework, but then also what maturity am I at in my organization? The ACT section of a framework is actually making sure that we've got everything in place, that we're tweaking our program to improve our controls and getting ready to start the cycle again to improve our overall security posture. So from a governance perspective, this is what we want an organization to be doing within their framework. And if they have not assessed their level of maturity, then we would do that maturity assessment. Really, I want the security team or the CIO to be driving the maturity levels. So let me get a little bit into looking at the model here. And I talked through a lot of this on the last slide already. So we're assessing our current security posture, which is what I spend a lot of my time on. But maybe we should look at how we compare to others in our industry. If you're in a community bank and you're outsourced to one of the big banking outsource processors, okay, can they give you a rating of security based on their other customers? If you're a manufacturing company or a distribution company or hospitality or something like that, compare yourself to others in your industry. And of course, similar size. Talk to some of your security vendors. Maybe they can share information about what others are doing that are in a similar space. The cybersecurity maturity model, I usually just say CMM, helps me figure out where I should spend my money. We've all got finite budgets. A friend of mine is the chief security officer at one of the largest banks in the world. And his budget is something like $2 billion. That sounds like a fortune. But if you compare that to other banks as a percentage of revenue, it's very similar. So that's where you've got to really figure out where you're going to spend your money. And you think you got $2 billion, you've got unlimited money? No, you don't. If you've got $50,000 or $500,000, where do you spend that money? Because what we've got to do is balance out our security investments against the risks that our organization faces and have some sort of a roadmap of where we want to go. So maybe our maturity level right now is at like 3. Do we want to be at 5? Okay. Then how do we get there? That's really what this CMM is looking about, and sharing the information of where that investment is with internal stakeholders like the board of directors to get them to be able to finance this and to buy into it. And by the way, to cover their rear ends, because now the SEC has requirements for cybersecurity reporting.
And one of the things, Jason, that comes to mind is also the importance of being realistic. So, to your point about the funding and the budget, but also in terms of where you are now in baselining and where you want to go, I think communication is essential to make sure that the CIO, the CISO, and in our role and capacity as auditors, that we are being aware of the fact that we want to make sure everything that is put on the table is realistic, is actionable, and is going to be monitored, so that if you say, okay, we're at 3, we want to get to 5, when, how, who, and what are some of the milestones that you're going to measure against to make sure you're making progress to hit those goals posed by the time you get to 2 years. And I'm just saying 2 years to get to 5, but what is the timeline and how you know you got there?
And Hernan, I don't know where you come up with these questions, but you're spot on to the next things that I wanted to cover. So let's look at what is the CMM. By the way, I got this particular slide from Department of Health and Human Services, and I really like the graphics on it. It's a very simple and easy way to understand it. So within the capability maturity model, there's these 5 levels. Initial means we're probably doing stuff ad hoc. We've probably got antivirus in, we've probably got a firewall in, but we're really in the initial infantile stages of security. Do we really want to get up to level 5 though? Probably not for most organizations. We probably want to get definitely beyond initial, beyond developing, because that's where we're really working a lot to improve in our environment. We probably want to get more into the 3, the defined or maintenance phase, and maybe some areas into the 4, which is managed, which means we're doing a lot of measurement around security. And to your question earlier, Hernan, this is where we talk to senior management about how we want to invest our time and effort. What's most important to us? If it's protecting the formula for Coke, or if it's protecting the PII of 10 million consumers, or if it's protecting the power grid, those are all very different things, but they all have one thing in common. They all help drive our investment in security and where we spend our money. So the CMM helps us figure that out. And when I get into CIS in a few minutes, we'll look at the specific controls, but which controls do we want to have in place at what maturity level to meet the expectations of our industry, our regulators, our customers, and our stakeholders. And so with that, it's actually a really good intro into how to do an audit. I'm going to use the Center for Internet Security Top 18 as a framework here. And so what we've talked a lot about the maturity levels, and this is one reason why I like CIS. They have what are called these IGs, or implementation groups. So the first thing we want to look at when we're auditing against a framework is what controls should we have in place. Now, the nice thing about CIS is they say there's 153 safeguards, to use their term, or controls that should be in place. By the way, some of these safeguards may have other things behind them that help support them. And now, do I need all 153 of those? Oh, okay, 153 controls doesn't sound too bad. But when you get into it, it's a real lot of work. So what CIS did is they broke it out into these IGs, or implementation groups. And depending on what you need to protect, you select or make sure that you have implemented 56 safeguards, or if you're in IG1. And as you can see there, it's more about small companies that have a limited security budget. Maybe they don't think they're a target for hackers. Okay, everybody's a target for hackers, but some companies are more of a target. If you have bank in your domain name, you're a much higher target than anybody else. If you're a retailer, you're a much higher target just because you're public. If you make consumer products, you're a much higher target because you're public. So if I'm not in one of those industries, I would be more in that implementation group 1. And there I'd have 56 controls, and I'll give an example in a couple of minutes of how we go down this a little deeper. Implementation group 2 is for larger companies. They're a little bit more complex, dealing with a little bit more sensitive data. They're a little larger, maybe international, maybe more regulatory requirements. Implementation group 3 adds in more controls, getting us up to that 153. This is all the multinational organizations, all the large government agencies. You've got to have these controls in place according to CIS. And again, I'm using CIS as an example here. If you were to do this assessment based on the NIST cybersecurity framework, NIST 853, PCI, or HIPAA, you would do roughly the same things. Now, keep in mind, though, that if you're doing this for HIPAA or for credit card processing, there's very explicit requirements. All the other frameworks are much more judgmental. And so that's something I need to keep in mind as I look at what controls we actually have in place.
Mhm.
Hernan, it
One
sounds
thing that
like you were
comes to
about
mind,
to ask a
Jason,
question.
I was, yes, I didn't want to interrupt you as you were finishing your thought. So one thing that comes to mind, though, is as you're looking at some of this, and of course we talk about risk-based auditing, and you did a very good job in terms of explaining different circumstances where an organization should take a look at themselves and consider their industry, their geographic or worldwide reach, and so on. But it helps us also if we were to reverse engineer the dynamic and ask in terms of risks. Because quite often we talk about brainstorming and what can go wrong and what are some of the possibilities of exposure and vulnerabilities. But if you were to take some of these very extensive and detailed lists, what we can then do is think in terms of, well, what will this protect us against, and use that as well as a brainstorming exercise to help fill in any of the gaps that may be there after you've done your exercise. I like to think of it in kind of that dynamic fashion, where you do some brainstorming and then you kind of check that list against other people, other sources, to make sure you didn't leave anything out. So from that perspective, I think that this serves a great purpose and should not be seen just as a compliance tool or just as a checklist, but rather think of it as a way to reverse engineer this dynamic that I just described. What do you think about that?
I like the question, and I think that that approach is really good. And so if you think about doing any kind of enterprise risk assessment or IT risk assessment, to go to the NIST risk management framework, it's a threat-based assessment model. Am I worried about uh, earthquakes, hurricanes, tornadoes? Am I worried about X, Y, Z? I can think about those threats, and then I can look at any one of these frameworks and look at some of the controls that are going to help reduce either the impact or the likelihood that that threat will cause negative impact in my organization. So that is definitely one way to look at this. Think about the threats or vulnerabilities or risks, whatever term you want to use there, to your organization, and think about what you want to do to secure your organization based on that model. What I was talking about more initially was more, I'm thinking about what assets I have and what I want to protect. So now if you want to blend the two of those, which my guess is you being more the auditor, you're going to try and think business side, where I've got more of that technology background. I tend to think more the technology side. So I think about what are my assets? What are the threats to those assets? And then which of these controls are going to really help me reduce the risk to the loss or damage to those assets? Is that what you're trying to
Like
get at?
Well, yes, absolutely. Yeah, I think that that is a very, very good way of bringing all of these interests and needs together so we can put together a very comprehensive mechanism to assess it. So I like that. I think that'll work perfectly.
Okay, great. Well, so let me dive a little bit deeper into this. So we've talked here about using the CIS and what implementation group you're in. But now, what are these 153 controls and how do these implementation groups work? So here's the control number one under CIS, and the control number one in pretty much every one of these frameworks is know your assets. What's your hardware? Where are your people? What buildings do you have? What data do you have? And how do you protect that data? And so within the implementation group that I'm in, again, sticking strictly to the CIS model here, I would look at, for inventory, I need there's 5 controls or safeguards total. In implementation group 1, there are two controls that I should have in place. And I just showed two of the different control levels here. So one is establish an enterprise inventory. You see that should be in place in all implementation groups. What do I have? If I don't know what I have, I don't know how to protect it. Now, in a large organization, you may have an active asset discovery tool, and maybe you've got a passive asset discovery tool. And so you'll see there, that's control number 5 or safeguard number 5 in the asset group. You can ask in your organization, well, out of these 5, which ones do I have in place? And I wouldn't expect smaller companies to have a passive asset discovery tool according to the CIS framework. Now, taking into account what Hernan asked a couple of minutes ago, if I've got a very large, geographically diverse network, maybe I want to have that asset discovery tool in place, even if I'm only in implementation group 1 or 2. So that's where you've got to look at how this fits in with your organization. And you can then audit against each of these things and ask, first off, do we have an asset inventory? Then you can dive a little deeper. How do we maintain it? Keep it up to date? Do we have asset discovery tools? And that's helping us move up the maturity levels. Now, if we move away from the CIS framework to any of the others that I'd mentioned, I do it roughly the same way. I'd look at what are the requirements in PCI. I'd look at what are the requirements in NIST 853. By the way, CIS has 18 control families or safeguard families. The NIST 853 framework has 20 families. They cover roughly the same things. But the nice thing in the NIST framework is in every one of those 20 areas, the first thing you have to have is a policy. So I got to maintain an asset inventory. So on my maturity level, how do I maintain that inventory? Is it a spreadsheet? Is it some sort of an automated tool? Is it updated every year? Okay, that's raising my maturity level. If I've got an automated tool, that's raising my maturity level because I'm updating my asset inventory very regularly. So I want to look at both the controls, the policies around them, the procedures for managing them, and are they operational day to day? So those are really the things that we want to cover when we're talking about any one of the frameworks. And again, I tried to use CIS as a benchmark here for our discussion on the frameworks. And I know we're going to have some time for Q&A. So if people have questions about some of the others, I can't go too deep into any of them, but I might be able to talk a little bit about how they apply in your organization or how they compare to this as a framework as well. So for wrap up here, number one, we've got to understand what framework we're using. Why are we using that framework? To understand that why, it goes back to the way we started this whole discussion off. What kind of data do you have? What laws and regulations impact your organization? Are we using the right framework? If you're using Jason's framework, it's not necessarily an audit finding because Jason's framework might be based on one of these others with a few tweaks to it. But ask why you're using Jason's framework or XYZ framework. Look at the maturity level in the framework. Is it being done ad hoc or very randomly? Is it being done on a real regular basis? Can you as an auditor audit it? Is there enough evidence to show that every control that should be in place is in place and operational? And then, of course, we issue an audit report. whatever your normal procedures are for that. Just a quick note on this around frameworks, particularly if the organization is not using a standard framework, ask why. Get information on that before you say, hey, we're using a bad framework. Or if there's something missing out of one of the more industry standard frameworks, ask why. There might be a legitimate reason that you're not doing something. So validate that up definitely before you issue your audit report. And then finally, one of the things that I always like to look at as an auditor is how can I add more value? So I don't want to just deliver a report and say, here's the report. I want to talk to the organization and say, what maturity level are we shooting for? And are we going to get there? And as auditors, can we help get there? So that's that strategic advisory role.
That's wonderful, Jason. Thank you so very much for helping us better understand how all of these pieces come together and some of the resources that are available to us. So in terms of the different frameworks, how we can apply them, how we can work more collaboratively with our counterparts in the organization and help to protect those very important assets. We'll be moving into the Q&A section in a moment, but before we do that, let's hear from Kelly.
Thanks, Jason and Hernan. To our viewers, if you have any questions, be sure to enter them now in the chat panel on the right of your screen. Now, before we get to the Q&A, I'd like to tell you about Audit Pro TV. Audit Pro TV is subscription-based, on-demand CPE learning that's effective and engaging. A one-year subscription actually costs less than a 3-day classroom course, and it allows you to gain access to a library of internal and IT audit, fraud, risk, and cybersecurity learning at any time from anywhere. Now, visit acilearning.com for all the details to learn more about Audit Pro TV and request your free demo to see what the fuss is all about. All right, Hernan, let's get started with our first question.
Great. So we have a question from Daveen, and the question is, please advise on your opinion of ISO 27001 as a cybersecurity framework.
Great question. So I didn't really get into some of those types of frameworks. ISO 27001 is a security framework. Historically, it's been used a lot more in the rest of the world than in the United States. It's a great security framework. The little bit of a drawback to ISO 27001 is it's really focused on information security. So if you're doing a cybersecurity audit, cybersecurity framework, yeah, absolutely. But it doesn't really get a lot into some of the governance things that some of the other frameworks do. Quick note on ISO 27001 and third-party service providers. If you're using third-party service providers and want to audit them, they might have an ISO 27001 certificate, which means that they have had an independent audit done against that ISO framework. That's a great way for me to know that XYZ company has a certain amount of controls in place. Now, to maybe stave off some other questions here, the SOC 2 audits, particularly the SOC 2 Type 2 audits, are another certification audit like the ISO 27001. The SOC audits are not exactly a framework, but they could be used to build a framework where ISO is truly a framework. So great question there.
Wonderful. Thank you very, very much. We have another question from Suhail, and the question is, I am adopting NIST 800-53 and trying to implement controls. Where should I start? Writing policies and procedures. Where should I start?
Oh boy, you picked a good one there. So if you're starting to implement NIST 853, the number one control you have to have in place in all of the NIST control families is a policy. So yeah, it'd be probably a good idea to, probably the second step, hit policies. The first step would probably be to do an assessment of what you've already got, what kinds of controls you have in place that are just not documented, to write the policies around those existing controls. And yeah, your question about selecting a baseline and starting to implement, think about what your industry is, what kinds of data you've got to protect, and how deep you want to go down those NIST 853 controls. It's a lot of work to really implement NIST 853 to pass it's called FedRAMP audit, to be able to be qualified to work with the federal government. It's a real lot of work. I'm pretty sure we've got some other webinars and seminars that cover that in more detail, but you can definitely start off with that assessment, write the policies that meet the NIST 853 requirements, but also reflect your environment, because you may not do things exactly the same way I do. So you've got to write your policies to fit your organization. So definitely a great question about that framework.
Okay, great. Thank you very much for helping us better understand how we can go about doing that. Here's another question. This one is from Alan. Regarding third-party verification, wouldn't it fundamentally be an external audit conducted by a reputable cybersecurity shop, such as, but not limited to, a Big 4 or a Big 8 accounting firm with cybersecurity credentials?
Ideally, absolutely. That's what most of us can rely on, and that's all most of us can do to audit third parties. Again, I don't know who's going to be watching this or participating in this today, but I bet that most of us cannot audit Microsoft, Google, Salesforce, or AWS. All we can do is rely on their SOC audit reports, their ISO certifications, and other things like that. Now, if you're auditing Jason's payroll service and you've got 10,000 employees, you might be able to come in and do an audit of me. That's something that's up to negotiation. Get that in your contracts that you have the right to audit if you possibly can. If you do get the right to audit, exercise it, even if it's just an on-site visit and a little review of policies and procedures. Now, to address one of your other comments there about a firm with cybersecurity credentials. So a CPA firm has to do a SOC 2 audit. I can't do one because I'm not in a CPA firm. To do an ISO 27000 audit, the auditors have to be certified to be able to do that. If I wanted to become certified to do ISO 27000 audits, I could do that. I just haven't chosen to do that with any of the organizations I've been with. Look at the quality of the firm doing those audits. If it's Jason's CPA firm, have you ever heard of Jason versus one of the Big 4 accounting firms or even the regional firms? Some of them are very, very good at what they do. Some of them, I don't know. I just don't know those firms well enough. But if, as a third party, I got an audit done by Jason's CPA firm, you've got to look at, is Jason really a reasonable person to be doing these audits? So yeah, absolutely look at that. Great question.
Very, very good points there, Jason. Thank you very much. A question from James. Can you have effective cyber controls without policies in place?
Oh, I get into arguments about this all the time. I'd say no. At a bare minimum, you need to have an information security policy that says you protect company and personal data. After that, there's certain things that I'd argue should be in that information security policy. But do you need an acceptable use policy? I'd say probably yes. That's probably a really good idea, because if one of your employees does something bad, can you fire them for it? That's going to depend on right to work laws and a lot of other factors. But if you've got a policy in place that they violated, then it's much easier to discipline somebody. It's also much And I'm not just saying everybody's bad, but it's also much easier to audit against things. If you don't have policies in place, yes, you might have very good controls in place. My recommendation would be start slowly documenting out those policies, particularly if you're in a regulated industry. Well, if you're in a regulated industry, you've probably already got some of those. But if you're dealing with PII, you're probably going to need policies. California's got the most onerous personal data protection law in the country. Connecticut now has a variation on it. Connecticut's is actually a little closer to Colorado's. Massachusetts has one, but I've been told it doesn't really have much teeth in the way of teeth behind it. But we're just going to see more and more of these laws coming out, and all of them say you need to have a policy. Oh, and by the way, don't forget New York's law about financial services companies. They do have teeth and they do go out and audit. So I think policies are very important.
Great. Thank you very much, Jason. I appreciate it. Question from George. What is your opinion of the FFIEC cybersecurity assessment tool?
Interesting. Okay, so let me share a little bit here. The FFIEC is the Federal Financial Institution Examination Council, the Office of the Comptroller of Currency, the Federal Reserve, the FDIC. They came up with this CAT to help banks do cybersecurity assessments internally. By the way, it is geared towards banks, but anybody can use it. It's free off of the FFIEC website. It's an Excel spreadsheet that you can do a rating on, and it does have a maturity level rating in it. The first version of it was a piece of junk, honestly. And I even actually talked with somebody who helped write it at the OCC. The new version of it is much better, but it's a lot of work to really go through it. But then again, any of these assessments are, and any of these frameworks are, it'd be a good place to start. But if you're just starting to look at implementing any kind of cybersecurity framework, anybody that looks at the CAT and goes through it, they're going to go, oh my gosh, what am I in for here? It's a lot to bite off. But by the way, any of these are, if you're starting from scratch, that's where if you use the FFIEC's CAT or any one of these, you've got to look at where am I today? Do that assessment, learn how the tool works, learn how the framework works, and then figure out where you want to be going. But it's another tool, and particularly in financial services, it might be the tool you use because the regulators can't argue against it. Versus if you're using Jason's framework, they can ask, who's Jason? So great question.
Okay, great. Thank you very much for helping us better understand that other tool and the number of different resources available to us. Ravi asks, what can we do around the Internet of Things devices with respect to cyber risks? Ravi states, I do not think any organization has matured enough on that front.
Oh, IoT gets to be really complex. It's easy when we're talking mainframes, Windows, Unix, because those have all been around for so long. The number one thing on IoT, I would say first is get an inventory. Okay, that's the number one control in most of these anyway. Who is managing IoT is another really big question. What kind of IoT is used in your organization? You're absolutely right. A lot of organizations aren't very mature in their management of IoT. So if you were to take, let me use the NIST, or sorry, not NIST, CIS top 18 controls. If you were to focus in on IoT and go through an assessment using CIS, you'd probably come up with a pretty good assessment. There are some IoT specific frameworks. I'm just not as familiar with them. I've started to learn about them a little bit more over the past year or two. But to your point, we're not mature in this area. that's where those asset management tools can be really helpful. A quick note here, if you're going into the cloud for IoT management, I know Google Cloud, the Microsoft Azure Cloud and AWS Cloud all have some IoT management tools in them. I have not had a chance to use any of them yet to give you any feedback on them, but they'd be a place to start for at least knowing what kind of IoT you've got. And then follow through with all these other questions.
Yes, and definitely an evolving dynamic there. So thank you very much for helping us better understand that growing field. Now we have one last question before we wrap up for the day, and this is also from Ravi. What are the key third-party exposures with respect to cybersecurity? What resources should I use?
Let's see, thinking third-party exposures. It gets to be an interesting topic because there's a few different companies that do ratings on particularly cloud providers, but technically on any type of a company. Some of them are free. Actually, unfortunately, very few of them are free. Most of them you have to pay for, but they will give you a rating of a company's cybersecurity environment. In one case, it's based on the IP addresses that are facing the internet and what kinds of SSL, TLS, encryption to and from those websites, what they can scan from a vulnerability perspective. Though, by the way, none of them are actually running true vulnerability scanners against these organizations. This is a very huge topic right now that we could probably spend another hour talking about, and it's changing so rapidly. So looking at some of these paid vendors is one way to do it. A non-paid way is to look at the CVE database, which is the Common Vulnerability and Exploit database that is maintained by Mitre. You can find it online, and they will have known vulnerabilities for everybody from Microsoft on down to medical device manufacturers and so on, to look at what are known vulnerabilities. But I think this is one, Hernan, we should probably look at for a future discussion around cybersecurity management.
Absolutely, Jason. Yes, this is a growing, it's an evolving, very dynamic topic that we definitely need to try to keep up with. So we'll definitely explore it further in the future. Jason, thank you so very much for your presentation, the clarity with which you presented the key topics around frameworks and policies and how we go about auditing this, and then being so generous with your time answering all of these questions. So thank you very, very much. It was really appreciated.
I'm happy to be here, Hernan. Thanks for having me be a part of this today.
Thank you. Goodbye, everyone, and looking forward to seeing you again the next time.
Thank you for joining today's webinar. You will receive a link to the webinar recording delivered to your inbox. See you next time.